This is the online lecture slideshow for Philosophy 131, Learning Module 5. The subject is Proofs of God. This is part 1 of 3. See Learning Module 5, Arguments for the Existence of God. In this module, you will understand why and how people attempt to prove that the God of Jews, Christians, and Muslims exists. We begin with an introductory overview of proofs of God and then focus on one proof in particular, namely, the ontological argument. We end this part of the module, which has 3 parts total, with a critical examination of the ontological argument, an argument based purely on reasoning about the concept of God. The specific learning objectives for this slideshow are answers to these questions. Number 1. How do Jews, Christians, Muslims define God? Number 2. Why do people try to prove that God exists? Number 3. How does one prove that God exists? Number 4. What are the top 3 traditional arguments for the existence of God? Number 5. How exactly does the ontological argument work and what are its criticisms? Question 1. How do Jews, Christians, and Muslims define God? The Judeo-Christian Muslim God is the omni-God, that is, the all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the cosmos. This conception of God is not the only description of God available. Thousands of other conceptions of God or gods are possible, given the history of humans and ideas. In this section, we focus on the Judeo-Christian Muslim conception because it is the most popular, contemporary, and influential view of God in religious doctrine and practice today. So this is our bias and our starting point. A big reason for focusing only on the Judeo-Christian Muslim God is that it is the only one for which thoughtful people and organized religions have provided serious argumentation. Polytheistic and animistic religions spend little or no time trying to prove that God exists. Buddhists, for the most part, are atheistic, or just non-believers, and also do not argue for or against the existence of any gods. For probably most religious people, logical proof is irrelevant, or foolish, or pernicious. People can believe anything on faith alone, which means one can have a belief for which evidence and argument are not required. Nevertheless, scholars find proofs useful and illuminating. Question 2. Why do people try to prove that God exists? Here are the top 3 reasons for arguing or proving that God exists. Number 1, proof of God is not required by believers, but it is useful to them. If one succeeds, one shows that belief in God is rational, and thus that believers are worthy of understanding, respect, tolerance among people of different faiths and non-believers as well. Number 2, sometimes faith alone is not enough. With proof available, one can reach the ignorant, convert infidels, save souls, answer skeptics, promote tolerance, and eliminate doubts. Reason 3. Given that God exists, civil society, morality, and social norms can be based on the divine plan. Many people of faith believe that we can better know what we should believe and what we should do by knowing what God is and wills for us. Question 3. How does one prove that God exists? You could use an argument based entirely on reason. Ontological arguments do this. We focus on this first. Or you could use an argument based primarily on observational evidence. Cosmological and teleological arguments do this. Or you could not do it. You could just believe Scripture and divine revelation. But recall that circular reasoning then becomes a big problem. Also, one must trust the authority of interpreters, and they disagree. Circular reasoning presumes what it does not prove. Okay, we're going to be talking about arguments, so let's look more closely at what an argument is. An argument is a collection of claims intended to establish the truth of a specific claim. That is, the conclusion or thesis. So an argument is not a fight. An argument is a proof from premises, evidence, or reasons, which are assumptions, definitions, alleged facts. We derive what follows logically. That is, we conclude what is claimed to follow from that evidence. So let's be clear. Issues, arguments, and conclusions. A conclusion or thesis is a statement about an issue or a subject of controversy. Arguments attempt to justify accepting a conclusion about an issue. Every conclusion is a statement whose truth needs to be demonstrated or proved using logic and evidence, not emotions or sincere professions of belief. So, all arguments are proofs, but only some of them produce sufficient or good reasons for their conclusions. A proof of God concludes that God exists based on logical, rational reasons. Whether an argument is good depends upon whether all of the reasons, premises, are true, and whether the reasons justify the conclusion, whether the reasons justify accepting the truth of the conclusion. Good arguments can be valid or strong. So here's the distinction. An argument is valid if and only if it is impossible for the conclusion to be false when all of its assumptions are true. An argument is strong if and only if it is improbable that the conclusion is false when all of its assumptions are true. So these are two kinds of good argument, valid or strong. Here's an example. Is this a good argument? Everything which exists, has ever existed, and will exist, taken as a whole, is the universe. This is an assumption. This is a kind of definition of the universe. Number 2, the universe is God. That is, everything is God. This is called pantheism. It's an ancient view. Conclusion, number 3, therefore, God exists. This argument is valid because if all of the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true also. There's no way for that conclusion to be false if the two assumptions, the definition and the identity, are true. But are all of the premises true? Okay, say one is true. Number 1 is true. Everything which exists, has ever existed, and will exist, taken as a whole, is the universe. Okay, that's the universe. But number 2 is not what mainstream religions identify as God. If one accepts this argument, then one has a proof of God, which describes a God not very much like the God that Jews, Christians, and Muslims worship. So if number 2 is true, if you accept number 2 and number 1, then you have a proof of God, but not the sort of God that Jews, Christians, and Muslims worship. Okay, now is this a good argument? Assumption 1. God is love. This comes from the Bible, the New Testament, John chapter 4, verse 16. Number 2, love is blind. Evidence of this comes from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. But love is blind, and lovers cannot see the pretty follies that themselves commit. Also, a research study in 2004 by University College London found that feelings of love suppress the activity of the areas of the brain that control critical thought. So love is blind. Number 3, Stevie Wonder is blind. Evidence of this comes from Wikipedia, or just Google it. Number 4, conclusion. Therefore, there is a God, and he is Stevie Wonder. All right, this is a really bad argument because even if all of the premises are true, which is doubtful, the conclusion is still false. So the idea here is that you can put together whatever you like as reasons for a particular belief, but whether those reasons adequately support belief in the truth of the conclusion is going to totally depend upon the reasons given. So if you want a proof, you've got to provide reasons. What is the relation between reason and faith? Anselm of Canterbury said famously that he believed so that he may understand. But isn't reason sometimes the enemy of faith? No. Reason aids understanding. Arguments offer rational reasons for belief. This is Thomas Aquinas' idea. He argued that reason supplements faith. For those capable, reason can help us to know that God exists and know what God is like by observing nature, God's creation. Nevertheless, reason and observation, though useful, are never necessary for faith or belief in God or anything. Arguments for the existence of God are either a priori or a posteriori. So this is an important distinction. A priori claims are known by thinking. You don't need any observations or experiences. Reason alone is sufficient. A posteriori claims are known by experience or observation. So there are two kinds of knowledge here, a priori knowledge versus a posteriori knowledge. Is sense experience the only way to acquire knowledge? Many don't believe so. Are there other sources? Arguments based on sensory experience, what I perceive, what I see, feel, hear, are called a posteriori, since we may know or believe the premises based on experience. Arguments are called a priori when we can know their premises by reason, independently of experience. So a posteriori means after experience. And it refers to knowledge that depends for its justification upon sensory experience. For example, some scientific knowledge is based solely upon observations. A priori means prior to experience knowledge that does not depend on any sensory experience. For example, some mathematical knowledge may be based upon reasoning alone. Such knowledge is available independent of experience. Here is an example of something known a posteriori based on experience. Fire is hot. Here is something we know a priori. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. This is the Pythagorean theorem. In Euclidean geometry, for any right-angled triangle, the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides. You might learn this by drawing squares and triangles, but it is true because it follows logically from the concepts or definitions of squares and triangles. So there are two kinds of logical proof available to us. An a posteriori argument or proof is based on assumptions that can only be known by means of experience. For example, an a posteriori proof of God demonstrates that God exists, say, by observing the amazing complexity and diversity of the natural world, and presuming that only God or divine intervention could produce it. An a priori argument or proof is based on assumptions that can only be known or presumed independently of experience. An a priori proof of God, then, is a proof of God's existence based on thinking and reasoning about God, given whatever definitions we accept or what Scripture, divine revelation, tells us, regardless of observations and sensory experience. For instance, all bachelors are unmarried males, and unicorns have horns, are each true because the meanings of the terms imply what cannot be false. The definition of bachelor implies that whatever is a bachelor can't be a married male. The concept of a unicorn requires that if some creature is really a unicorn, then it has one horn. There is no way that any creature could be a unicorn and also not have one horn. So the term God refers to whatever all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good being could create the world, regardless of whether we experience its greatness. Question 4. In brief, what are the top 3 traditional arguments for God's existence? Question 4. In brief, what are the top 3 traditional arguments for God's existence? Question 4. In brief, what are the top 3 traditional arguments for God's existence? First, there's the ontological argument. Anselm, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz have given ontological arguments. They go something like this. Number 1, God is, by definition, the supremely perfect being, that is, the subject of all perfections, where a perfection is an unlimited positive property. Number 2, existence is a perfection. Number 3, therefore, God has existence. That is, God exists, and necessarily so. Ontological arguments are arguments for the conclusion that God exists from premises derived from some source other than observations of the world. For example, from reason and thinking about the concept of God. If the definition, number 1, is true, then the conclusion 3 has got to be true also. It can't be false. Notice that it doesn't matter whether you accept the definition. What matters is whether the definition of it is true. There are many versions of this argument. Above is a simple version. Later I present Anselm of Canterbury's more sophisticated version. The cosmological argument. Here's the cosmological argument. My variation here is based on Thomas Aquinas. I'm going to state the argument in 8 steps. We need a definition. First, a maximally infinite being is one that is infinite in extent in every way, as well as fully eternal. That is, eternal backwards and forwards in time. Presume that only God is such a being. Premise 1. Every concrete thing, except for a maximally infinite being, has a distinct cause. This is called the principle of causality. It's a fundamental premise. The causality relation is understood here to be transitive and irreflexive. Okay, what does this mean? Nothing is a cause of itself, not even God, by irreflexivity, but every member of a causal chain is a cause of every subsequent member of that chain by transitivity. So God is eternal and uncaused. Premise 2. There cannot be an infinite series of distinct causes. Otherwise, an infinite amount of time would have to be completed in order that the present effect follow, which is impossible. This is a fundamental premise. If this is false, then an infinite series of causes and effects is possible, and the proof breaks down. Premise 3. Therefore, the total series of distinct causes ending with me is finite and must have a first term, that is, a first cause, by premise 1 and 2. Continuing the argument here. Premise 4. Consequently, this first cause is a maximally infinite being. Otherwise, by premise 1, it would itself have a distinct cause. It would need a cause, and thus wouldn't really be first in the series. Something else would be first. Premise 5. Thus there exists a maximally infinite first cause, by premise 1 through 4. Premise 6. There exists at most one maximally infinite being. Otherwise, one such being would limit the other such being's extent in some way, thereby violating the above definition. Premise 7. Therefore, there exists exactly one maximally infinite first cause, which we may with justification call God, by premise 5 and 6 above and the definition. Okay, a hidden or presumed premise here is this. Being maximally infinite includes being all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, eternal, etc. And so, given this, the conclusion, number 8, is that God exists. God is that maximally infinite being, the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, eternal being, the first cause of the universe. Next, the teleological argument. We're summarizing here, okay? We'll get back to these arguments. So, here's a version of the teleological argument based on David Hume and William Paley and others. Premise 1. The physical world as a whole and in its parts shows a great deal of order and design, on analogy with a complicated watch. Any given watch is, with highest probability, designed by an intelligent being, rather than coming together by chance. Therefore, the physical world is, with at least high probability, designed by an intelligent being, rather than coming together by chance. Moreover, this intelligent being is proportionally as great as the design of the physical world. This is called the intelligent design argument. There are many versions. in a later presentation, we focus on more sophisticated versions and in greater detail. For background, skim the Wikipedia entry on intelligent design. It is thorough and fairly accurate, and we'll say a lot more about intelligent design later. But this is the design argument. Question 5. How exactly does the ontological argument work, and what are its criticisms? Now let's look at the ontological argument in greater detail. Anselm thought that to deny the existence of God is foolish. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 11th century. He produced a philosophical argument for the existence of a Judeo-Christian Muslim God. The concept of God, he thinks, implies that God must exist. So this is an a priori proof. We're going to get the existence of God from the concept, the idea of God. Anselm thinks that anyone who fully understands what God is cannot consistently deny that God exists. Only someone who is dull and a fool does not realize this. Anselm defines God in this way. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. This is the clearest concept of God we can have. Anselm presumes there are two ways something may be said to exist. One way of existing is to exist in the understanding, that is, to be present or thought of in the mind. God exists in this sense in our minds. Another way of existing is to exist in reality, outside of minds, independently of anyone's thoughts. Anselm assumes also that existence in reality is better or greater than existing only in the understanding. Here's a simplified version of Anselm's ontological argument. This is a very difficult argument to understand, but when you do, you will see how compelling it can be. I'll try to state it here first in simpler, plainer English. There are more sophisticated versions. Anselm shows us why we should reject premise 2 below. Take some time to process this. Premise 1. Suppose, by definition, God is that being than which nothing greater can be conceived. God is the greatest being one can conceive of. Premise 2. Now suppose, for the sake of argument, that God exists in the understanding, our minds, but not in reality, outside of our minds. Realize that existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. Premise 3. Now assume that God's existence in reality, and not just our minds, is conceivable to us. So if God did exist in reality, he would be greater than he is in our minds. Premise 4. So it is conceivable that there is a being greater than God. Premise 5. Therefore, it's conceivable that there is a being greater than the being than which nothing greater can be conceived. But wait, premise 6. That's absurd. It's a contradiction. Premise 5 can't be true. We can't conceive of what we can't conceive of. Conclusion 7. Therefore, it's false to say that God exists in the understanding but not in reality. Premise 2 is false, since we can't conceive of the greatest being conceivable, not actually existing also. If you really understand the concept of God, you can't imagine God as not existing. Otherwise, you could imagine something greater, namely the concept of God, the idea of God actually having something it corresponds to in reality. Anselm thought that God cannot be conceived of as not existing. You can't think of God and not think of something which must exist. Here are excerpts from his Proslogium, chapter 1. I do not endeavor, O Lord, to penetrate your sublimity, for in no wise do I compare my understanding with that. But I long to understand in some degree your truth, which my heart believes and loves. For I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand. For this also I believe, that unless I believed, I should not understand. From chapter 2 of the Proslogium. And so, Lord, do you, who do give understanding to faith, give me, so far as you knowest it to be profitable, to understand that you are as we believe, and that you are that which we believe. And indeed, We believe that you are a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Or is there no such nature, since the fool has said in his heart there is no God? And from chapter 3, that which can be conceived not to exist is not God. You're not really thinking about God if you're thinking about a God, the greatest being possible, which doesn't also exist in reality outside of our own minds. So Anselm thought that if you understand what God is, then you understand that God is. From the Proslogium, he says, certainly that than which a greater cannot be thought cannot exist in the understanding alone. He's saying it's got to exist in reality. For if it is in the intellect alone, it can be thought to be also in reality, which is something greater. If, therefore, that than which a greater cannot be thought is in the intellect alone, that very thing than which a greater cannot be thought is that than which a greater can be thought. But surely that can't be. Therefore, without a doubt, something than which a greater cannot be thought exists, both in the understanding and in reality. Okay, so here in outline form then is his Anselm's ontological proof of the existence of God. Again, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Now we understand the concept of that than which nothing greater can be thought, which means that than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind, the understanding. At least we can conceive of God as existing. Now, premise 3, if something exists in the mind only, then it is not as great as if it were to exist in reality as in the mind. Existence in reality is greater than existence in the mind alone. Premise 4. If A, that than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind only, then B, something greater than that than which nothing greater can be thought. Premise 5. But something greater than that than which nothing greater can be thought cannot be thought. What he's saying here is that premise 4 for B is absurd. It doesn't make any sense. Therefore, conclusion, that than which nothing greater can be thought does not exist in the mind only. That is, it exists in reality. The fool says, in his heart there is no God. But certainly, Anselm says, that very same fool, when he hears the expression, something than which nothing greater can be thought, understands what he hears. And what he understands is in his understanding, even if he doesn't understand that thing to exist. For it is one thing to be in the understanding, and another to understand a thing to exist. Therefore, even the fool, he is compelled to admit that there is in his understanding something than which nothing greater can be thought. Since when he hears this, he understands it, and whatever is understood is in the understanding. What Anselm's doing here is saying is this: if you've got the concept of God as that being than which nothing greater can be thought, then you've got something which must exist. Because if it didn't exist, it existed only in your mind, then you could think of something greater, namely something which existed in your mind and in reality. So he's giving you the concept of God and showing you that from the concept of God, there's no way there couldn't be something in reality which corresponds to it. So let's look at some criticisms of the ontological argument. Okay, so what you need to do is look at the outline of the argument. It's got 6 steps in the sketch I've given you. There are 3 Christian objections to Anselm's ontological argument. Let's consider those of Thomas Aquinas. Criticism 1. Anselm presumes too much. That is, premise 1 in his argument is false. What's premise 1? We understand the concept of that than which nothing greater can be thought. Aquinas says, there is no such being in our minds because it is not possible to know him. God's essence is inscrutable. It is not possible to have an idea of what he is by analogy or comparison either, because there is nothing like him. No man has enough knowledge of God's nature to assert his presence from it. This is St. Thomas Aquinas' objection. A comment. Okay, but if this is so, if Aquinas is correct, then we can't say anything ever about God, since we can't really know him. This objection is too powerful. It undermines the credibility of every religious claim uttered by any human who ever says something about God. And this includes all pious or respected people who say we can't know God also. But it's a powerful objection. If we can't know God, then the argument doesn't work. The proof fails. Here's the second objection from Thomas Aquinas. Anselm only proves that if one thinks of God clearly and distinctly, one cannot think of God as not existing. This is Aquinas' criticism. It cannot be argued that it actually exists unless it is admitted that there really is something than which nothing greater can be thought. And it is precisely this that is not admitted by those who hold that God does not exist. A comment. Anselm maybe proves that we cannot think of God as non-existent. But what does our lack of imagination about a world without God have to do with reality? Anselm presumes a dubious general principle. Since I can't imagine a world without God, or I can't imagine God not existing, therefore God must exist. But this is easily refuted. I can't imagine a world without Santa Claus, but maybe there still is no Santa Claus. Another case, I can't imagine a world without angels, demons, leprechauns. Therefore, these must exist. Can you think of other counterexamples? In short, we don't want to place artificial limits on reality by saying that whatever we cannot conceive of is impossible. Here's the third Christian objection. This is that of Gonilo, a monk who lived in the day of Anselm. He thought Anselm proved too much. If this sort of argument is logically valid, we could think into existence all sorts of unreal mythical beings, perfect islands, perfect mates, democracies, honest politicians, etc. Our ability to have ideas or coherent concepts about any entity doesn't support or require its extra-mental existence. This is the monk Gonilo of Marmotier's objection. A comment. Anselm only proves that if God exists necessarily. So, if the sort of God he refers to would have to exist, you don't prove it is necessarily true. And so you are not entitled to accept it, unless there really is such a being in the first place, which is what Anselm fails to demonstrate, which is what he needs, so the argument gets off the ground. Anselm responds to the criticism of Gonilo by saying that his definition only applies to God. And maybe he's correct, but Gonilo's objection shows that something is wrong with the argument even if we can't pinpoint it. At least Anselm and others who use this argument owe us a separate argument for accepting that only God could be perfect and exist necessarily. Shall we accept that only God is the greatest conceivable being before we get proof that such a being exists? Let's take a close look at Gonilo's objection here. One can conceive of the most excellent island that is greater than all islands. It would be the greatest conceivable island were it to exist in reality and in the intellect. So, shall we conclude that such an island actually exists, must exist even? Even if it is lost to us, we can think of the greatest conceivable island. So such an island must, in reality, exist, right? Now look again at Anselm's proof to see where the problem comes in. It's with premise 3. If something exists in the mind only, then it is not as great as if it were to exist in reality as well as in the mind. Let me show you what I mean. Here's what Anselm presumes in his argument. A perfect being, namely God, must exist in reality as well as the understanding, since such a being existing only in the understanding is not perfect. It would be less than perfect. It could not be God. Or, if we can think of X as being perfect, then X must actually exist, since X would be less than perfect if it did not exist. Because if X is truly perfect, then it can't not exist, since non-existence is an imperfection. In short, Anselm just assumes without proof that whatever is perfect must exist, and that God is the only perfect being possible. Does this escape Gonelo's objection? Most people don't think so. So the problem there is premise 3. Other people have focused on premise 3 being a problem. That is, if something exists in the mind only, then it's not as great as if it were to exist in reality as well as in the mind. So here are the modern objections to Anselm's argument. Anselm just presumes that existence somehow makes something greater. Premise 3 is false. Perhaps premise 4, whatever exists is greater in some way than what does not. But existence, that a concept has an example, that an idea has something which corresponds to it, adds nothing to the concept of greatness, or the concept of God, or the concept of $1 million. Existence is not a great-making property. It remains logically possible that no God exists. Even if, were God to exist, God must be perfect. Modern problems continued. Number 6, a property of an alleged entity, a characteristic of an alleged thing, never guarantees that any instance of that property actually exists. Whether God or devils exist cannot be proven by analyzing their concepts. Unicorns have horns. Only describes what unicorns, were they to exist, are like. The same goes for devils and gods. This is Bertrand Russell's objection. Problem 7. The argument features a dubious assumption that all perfect beings are actual, therefore some actual being is perfect. And this is false. This is a bad pattern of reasoning called in logic a quantifier shift fallacy, or if you like, a birthday fallacy. This is a sophisticated objection, but here it is. It's the idea that everyone has a birthday, right? So there must be one day, one particular day, that is everyone's birthday. Do you see the mistake? To say that everyone has a birthday is true, but we can't conclude that everyone has one day in particular, on which everyone is born. Each of us, has our own birthday. So we can't presume that from the fact that a perfect being is actual, that there is any such being. Here's the reasoning. All unicorns are animals. Okay? So some animals are unicorns. Do you see the problem? By definition, unicorns are animals. But does this prove that in reality there exist some animals which are actually unicorns? This is what Anselm does in his argument. All perfect beings are actual. Therefore, some actual beings are perfect. Presto, God exists. So here's a summary of reasons why some people reject the ontological argument. We accept that it's possible that God exists. The issue is whether God actually exists. The ontological argument aims to show God is actual because God cannot not exist. This is a dubious assumption. First, you need to prove that God actually exists. All forms of the ontological argument either state or presume that if God exists, then God necessarily exists. But why shall we accept this? We can conceive of God as not existing. Lots of people do. Next, one must show that God is perfect. Right? It's possible that God is not perfect or that God does not exist necessarily, since it's possible that any God, as described by people, does not exist. Only then can one conclude that God exists and is perfect. Only when you can show that God is perfect can you show that God exists. So if someone presumes that a perfect being must exist, we should not be surprised when they conclude that since God is perfect, then God exists. Must any perfect being exist at all? It's logically true to say that if it is impossible that God does not exist, then God exists necessarily. But why should we grant that it is impossible that God does not exist? We can conceive of God as non-existing or imaginary. If it is possible that God does not exist in reality, then it's a mistake to say that God must exist. Responses to criticisms of God proofs in general. Let it go. Accept the reconstruction of the argument given and its criticisms, and decide that the argument does not establish what it was intended to establish. You could reject the reconstruction of the argument as being uncharitable to the text, unfair. You could reject the criticisms as failing to undermine the premises. You could reconstruct the argument so as to avoid the criticisms. You can look for some better argument in the original text. You can give up on that kind of proof or all proofs. This is the end of part 1 of 3 parts in Learning Module 5.